Shalom. We're reading this week in the Torah portion of Vayera, which begins in Genesis 18, with Abraham sitting in the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. So let's talk for a moment about Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin was one of the important founding fathers of the United States. He was a leading author, political theorist, politician, printer. He's credited with the invention of the Franklin stove, bifocals, the lightning rod, etc. And in Poor Richard's Almanac, Benjamin Franklin quipped, "Fish and guests stink in 3 days." So, that is clearly not a Jewish attitude, or the take on having guests over at the home that was shared by our patriarch Abraham. Abraham, who is associated, identified with the midah of chesed, the attribute of loving kindness, is called the true man of kindness. In every aspect, every fiber of his being, he emulated godliness by seeking out ways of kindness and opportunities for bestowing kindness upon others, especially the commandment to entertain guests, to have guests in one's home. Our sages teach us that Abraham's tent was open from all four sides, and he pitched it at a crossroads so that he would have the opportunity to constantly be on the lookout for guests that might be passing by in order for him to bestow upon them his ample hospitality. As we have discussed in the past regarding the opening verses of chapter 18 of the book of Genesis, Parshat Vayera, there is a very great secret in that Abraham, who was recuperating, convalescing from the painful operation, the ordeal of his circumcision on the third day when he was in particular pain, God found it necessary to make it especially hot, extraordinarily hot, so that he would not be bothered with wayfarers. And that's why the verse tells us that he was sitting like in the heat of the day. It was an unnatural heat, but God was surprised to see that the pain that he suffered from the lack of his ability to bestow kindness upon strangers was worse than the pain that he suffered from his operation, and therefore sent 3 angels in the guise of men in order for him to bestow upon them his hospitality. Our sages make a very elusive statement. They teach in Tractate Shabbat of the Talmud that having guests in one's home, contrary to what Benjamin Franklin taught, is even greater than receiving the Shekhinah, the divine presence. It's so great is the concept of entertaining guests that it actually outshadows, it's actually greater than a communion with the divine presence itself. And one can ask, after all, maybe we can understand old Benjamin Franklin just a little bit. It's nice to have company over, but it turns the house upside down, and we love having you, but when are you going, type of thing. And after all, I could even look at it this way. It keeps me from Torah study, and there are all sorts of sins potentially that are also connected with the challenge of having guests over. Maybe they're going to speak gossip, tale-bearing. Maybe we're going to get involved in all sorts of forbidden situations. So what is this enigma that having guests over is even greater than entertaining the divine presence? And our sages very closely tie this concept in with the very nature, the very character of Abraham, who was the personification of the aspect of chesed, of kindness. Avraham, Abraham the patriarch, was machnis oreach. That means that he brought in a guest. But our sages point out in a very mystical tradition that oreach is really or chet, the light of 8. And 8, in this case, symbolizes the coming world, the next world. Abraham, by his act of loving kindness, by his bringing guests into the home, was actually spreading the light of the world to come in this world. And so it's really no wonder that our sages teach us there's a comparison between guests in the home and the divine presence. Because after all, the greatest aspect, the greatest example of having a guest over is when we welcome the divine presence into this world, which of course is the secret of the Holy Temple. And we are taught that the Holy Temple is in the portion of Benjamin. And Benjamin, above all others, had the capacity ingrained within him from birth, perhaps to be more sympathetic and to understand the plight of the guest, the wayfarer, one without a place, because he himself was born on the road. And perhaps this is the secret of the divine presence being welcomed in the portion of Benjamin. Clearly we see our forefather Abraham in his great desire to bring godliness into the world, his great desire to emulate the attributes of the divine, in his great personal identification with the aspect of chesed, loving kindness. He found a very great vehicle for this in the commandment that we can all emulate, the loving kindness of entertaining guests. So with all due respect to Benjamin Franklin, we have to try to separate between the fish after 3 days and the guests after 3 days, because really, according to our sages, one of the greatest commandments that we can fulfill and emulate true godliness in this world is the great commandment of hachnassat, orchim, entertaining guests in our home.